Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 5, Episode 2, presented by MarketDial. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, I'm back. I'm back online, and I'm back from a fun week with the family in Amsterdam. Great to be back on the mic with you and reconnected to the internet. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it's our first solo episode of the season. We're talking about buying versus shopping and how understanding the difference can really help retailers think through their core business strategy.
Yeah, as we'll talk about in a minute, this buying versus shopping distinction is something I delved into a bit in my book. Mm-hmm. And it's something I've been following. And the more and more I think about it and look at different examples, the more important I think it is as something for retailers to be paying even greater attention to.
So for the listeners who might have detected some different sound tones over this last episode and a little bit of this one, it was actually recorded on a different mic for me. Rogers Communication in Canada, I worked for them at the shopping channel. My entire home communications collapsed last Friday. And it didn't just collapse the internet, but it collapsed the mobility as well. Not supposed to happen, right? So everyone, about 10 million Canadians, lost internet, mobile, everything. You were kind of chuckling. I was scrambling to go to my mom's place. It's got a different provider, with the mobile mic kits.
Are you living in her basement, Michael?
Yeah, the secret is out. I'm actually living in my mom's basement, but she's got a good internet. So, hi, Mom. Can I borrow a cup of internet? And then I had to go to, do stuff in Amsterdam. And so whatever. But the key takeaway is, and I thought this was interesting, and I've talked to a bunch of retailers about this, for 2 days, almost 2 entire days, cash was king again. And again, this was never supposed to happen, right? You were never supposed to lose both internet and mobile. You lost them both. So the retailers who had no facility to take cash basically had to close their doors, or some handed out IOUs. So, just a heads up to the retailers that what wasn't supposed to happen can happen. Just a thought around how and where you go to market and what technology you use. And, sometimes the unbelievable happens.
Yeah, this I think came up through our first season when we were in the height of COVID. Just how much can you plan for the unimaginable, or maybe not unimaginable, but very hard to imagine, and you can't build a ton of redundancies for every possible contingency, or you'd be out of business just from the cost of putting that into place. But at the same time, not having those contingency plans, not building that agility into your business model obviously has caught, whether we're talking about supply chain or other kind of, local fulfillment, whatever. I mean, all these kinds of things. I mean, shit does happen, right? And it just shows how dependent in particular we become on being constantly connected. We just sort of take that for granted.
Let's talk about remarkable retail in Amsterdam. I mean, I spent a week there with the family and traveled all over the Netherlands to Rotterdam. It's a great place for barrels of candy. Let me tell you that. I'd never seen so many stores dedicated to open barrels of candy. Pictures up on LinkedIn, and of course, lots of cheese shops. And in Rotterdam, I don't know if you know anything about what happened during the Second World War. Basically, the Nazis leveled Rotterdam. So the whole city, practically, it's a big port city, the biggest port city in Europe, is new. And the architecture is stunning. And there's there's a food hall there that is just stunning. So I'll be putting up some pictures of that. So it's neat. There's the usual cast of characters, your chain stores, not a lot of department stores, lots of specialty, but it was fun. And I'll be sharing some of that on LinkedIn. Let's talk about what's going on in retail news. I saw some numbers over my news feed about inflation in the U.S. What's going on? Yeah,
last week, inflation monthly report, I guess, came out, and inflation was at 9.1%, which is the highest it has been in 40 years. So I think that's quite interesting. And we've touched on inflation obviously in multiple episodes. I think inflation is going to continue. I mean, hopefully inflation will start to moderate towards the back end of the year, but I think inflation is just going to be part of the retail equation for a period of time. The other thing to say about inflation is, that's the average inflation rate. So if you kind of dive down beneath the surface and look at some of the component pieces, the so-called core inflation, which takes out the volatility of food and gas, that was 5.9%, which is still probably historically quite high, but not quite so bad. Grocery was at 15%, which I've never heard of numbers like that. Fuel is starting to move around. I think you talked about in Canada, it's been coming down. In the U.S., it's down about 50 cents a gallon in the last month. So that's still high, but improving. So this is going to move around, and certainly it seems like the various banks. The Federal Reserve is about to raise interest rates. I think Canada took them up 100 basis points. A bunch of the other countries around the world are taking them up. So, there's a lot of monetary policy trying to
tapping the brakes,
put the brakes on this without creating a lot of job losses. So we'll see. But I was trying to tie this to what we see just in general in some of the broader retail stats. So the other thing that came out last week was the June monthly sales numbers from the U.S. Census Bureau. And they were up 8.4% year over year. So if you think the average inflation is something like 9%, that basically suggests that unit growth was, flat-ish. It's hard to tell. If you go a little bit deeper in some of the component pieces, what I thought was interesting is that online and other non-store sales, which is kind of the proxy for e-commerce, it's not exactly right. That was actually up close to 10%. And that's, I think, the first time we've seen strong growth there in a little bit. But general merchandise stores and clothing and accessory stores, clothing and accessory stores were basically flat year over year. General merchandise stores, so this is both department stores, Walmart, Target, those sorts of stores, were up just 2.1%. So if you factor in inflation there, it looks like there was quite a bit of loss of transaction volume. And then electronics and appliance stores, the last one I'll mention, were down. Was I think the only major category that was down, and it was down 8.7%.
And there was all this a factor of so many people bought so much stuff. You've talked about it. It brought forward sales. So really, those are big numbers last year when people were kitting up their home. I'm not sure how important. It's a big number, but is it a strategic shift, or is it just people just bought so much stuff they're just running out of stuff to buy?
Well, I think there's two things going on here. One is that. The other is I saw another report from eMarketer about the degree of promotional intensity in the consumer electronics business. And it apparently is way up, both year over year and month over month. And we know that Best Buy, Target, Walmart, others have talked about being really over inventoried in consumer electronics. So I think this is a combination of the prices being pushed down as well as the deceleration in volume. So it's great that people are still opening their wallet. Yep. Definitely some storm clouds on the horizon. But I think in terms of retail activity, we're definitely see a slowing down. And I also took a look at some of our friends at Placer AI's data on store traffic. And store traffic across pretty much every category has been down on a 3-year basis during the past 4 or 5 weeks. So that's another thing to be concerned about.
Thinking back to our last episode with Seth Godin, I got his book, by the way, because I didn't have his book. It's for those who hadn't picked it up yet. It's not just a small pocket book. It's a big book. It's physically big,
a very serious effort. A ton of info.
And I've been going through it, and I think you had the benefit of having a publisher's copy. But it's a great book. Like it is what he says. It practically explains a lot of stuff. So if you haven't picked that book up yet. Listen to the interview if you haven't, but pick that book up because it's a great read. Where I was going with that is, we were talking off mic about how hot it was where you are and many places in the States. I wonder if eventually that starts to slow down shopping. Like it becomes, in one hand, I guess you go to the mall to get chilled off, but on the other hand, it does start to slow things down when it's kind of the heat that you're experiencing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. I do think certainly my experience here in Texas is that it does cause people to consolidate trips or just go out, less frequently. So it wouldn't surprise me if that's something we're seeing in the numbers. I think the other thing, which of course nobody likes to talk about anymore, is COVID. There's
what?
I know, right? The numbers continue to increase. I know a ton of people that have had COVID in the past month or so, just anecdotally talking to some people in various industries. They have a lot of people that are out sick. And so, this all has a ripple effect as well. And, the reported numbers, which are up and the hospitalizations are up, fortunately, the deaths are not up very much. Yeah. The reported numbers, because of so much at-home testing, don't really reflect what's actually going on. So I think as that's been ticking up, particularly over the last month, that's probably got a bit of a dampening effect on store traffic, which may help explain a little bit why e-commerce was a bit better last month than it has been.
Let's talk about Prime Day a little bit. I mean, I think you and I share the same philosophy. It's one retailer's sale. I mean, they've done a good job of hyping it up, but it happened last week, and some big numbers came up here, there, and elsewhere. But I think there's 2 Prime Days this year, or 4 Prime Days this year. I mean, it's really just blending in. It's really
Prime
just
Days, yeah.
Prime Day, DAZE. I mean, it's really just blending in. Does Prime Day still matter to the industry, and as much you think to Amazon itself?
Well, it's I got into a little bit of a social media battle because I said that basically don't pay any attention to the Prime Day numbers without broader context, and I was deliberately being a little bit inflammatory, as I'm wont to do sometimes. But my point is that, and I have, and you probably do as well, firsthand experience studying promotional events, and I worked with a retailer a number of years ago where we had a big event somewhat similar to Prime Day. We kept finding that the results looked really good. And so we kept enhancing it every time we ran it. And every time we enhanced the value, which was basically more discounts, our sales got even better. And so we kept doing it. And this went on for 2 or 3 years until finally said, why don't we take a broader look at our sales performance and our margin performance? And as it turns out, without getting into too much detail, basically by offering better deals, all we did was pull sales that we would have gotten anyway from the period before or after the event at a lower margin. So in fact, our conclusion that it was working better and better was 180 degrees different from what was actually the case.
Which is actually, it's funny because on a broader context, the same could be said about Black Friday. Generates excitement in the industry, gets people shopping, but does it really actually, lift the overall consumption up? Maybe, but
well, yeah. I mean that has been studied, and I think it's somewhat inconclusive. And I think a lot of people feel that they have to participate in it to to preserve market share and to reduce margin exposure going into the holiday. There's a lot of other factors there. But my point with Prime Day in particular is, just focusing on the number and saying, they had a sales increase of, I think it was around 8% compared to last year, which was 6%, is almost meaningless. Because if they accomplish that by discounting more aggressively and moving sales around, it could actually be worse than the year before. So anyway, I think that, yes, it's important. A number of players like Walmart decided not to play, try to counteract it. And I think that's largely because both they and Target have been aggressively promoting pretty much for the last month or so.
I advise my clients to stay away because it also legitimizes it as an entire retail event versus an individual event. Like I think it gives it a bigger image when everybody joins on, and then suddenly it's a retail event driven by Amazon versus it's one retailer doing an event. Anyway, that's always.
No, I totally agree. I think if you're going to, I think there's a certain amount that is just sensible to do tactically to preserve market share. I wouldn't totally run away from it, but to basically copy another competitor, I think doesn't give you that branded experience. And it's just really, you're just chasing the promiscuous shopper ultimately, which longer term is probably not what you want to do.
We'll be right back with our thoughts on the strategic implications of understanding the difference between buying versus shopping right after this important message. MarketDial is an easy-to-use testing platform and emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With MarketDial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. In a challenging retail climate of supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and dynamic customer behavior, the need for reliable insights has never been greater. Validate your remarkable ideas with MarketDial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at MarketDial.com. That's MarketDial.com.
Well, Steve, we're here to talk about buying versus shopping. Now, in one way, it's an intriguing concept that the two are often interchangeable in terms of terms. But in reality, as you articulate it, and as you articulated it in your book, but we're here to kind of flesh the idea out, they're actually different things, but they still connect at a very strategic level. So talk about, what does this all mean? And we're going to get into the history a little bit because it's very insightful. We were talking about this off mic. So let's start with the big things. Like, what are the big three things? I like to frame things in three that you're
that are top of mind for you that you're thinking about as we explore this buying versus shopping concept?
I'll try to define it a little bit more precisely in a few minutes. And I will say that this distinction between buying versus shopping is not something that I came up with on my own. Other people have pointed to it. But I've become really fascinated by this definition and distinction because I think if we start to understand it and we think about how digital technology in particular has driven disruption over the past really 2 decades, this distinction between buying and shopping and how convenience has evolved helps us understand why we've seen, my favorite term, bifurcation, and the collapse of the middle. I think it also helps us explain, and I think we can get into a few specific examples in a few minutes, why certain retailers have been winning, not only, in the last couple of years, but over the longer term, and why others are losing. And I also think if we get a bit more tactical, if we think about whether the consumer is in buying mode or shopping mode, because we all can be in one of those modes at different times, it can really help us design or figure out how to improve the customer experience, how to better target our marketing. So there's a lot of tactical as well as strategic implications of understanding buying versus shopping. So that's why I think it's worth trying to dig into more and getting into some of the specifics.
When you say buying, what do you mean? When you say shopping, what do you mean?
Buying is really more of a need-based activity, and shopping is more of a want-based. But if we want to kind of unpack that a little bit more, but I'd also then like to drop back and talk about how this has really changed over the last 2 decades, because I don't think this distinction was particularly useful 15 or 20 years ago. It's become much more useful in recent years. But I think if you think about buying, we're completing a task, getting something off our to-do list, generally speaking, convenience, both in terms of easy access and speed, and price tend to be important drivers. Brand preference, not typically so much. And I think if you think about kind of the consumer end state, we're not very emotionally attached to the outcome. So we are search driven, whether that's online or in a store, and we basically go where we can get that item off our to-do list as quickly as possible. To contrast that with shopping, it's much more about effectiveness over efficiency. We're meeting a want or some sort of solution or more emotionally based need. It's much more discovery driven as opposed to search. And one of the big characteristics is that we're generally speaking willing to invest a lot more time or effort to get the right outcome. And probably not too surprisingly, brands tend to be more important. So, left brain, a lot of different, have been making these lists of sort of the comparisons, right. But, left brain versus right brain, science versus art, head versus heart, ease versus inspiration. There's a whole bunch of these maybe we'll come back to in terms of how you sort of decide. But
yeah, well, that's a good segue, because let's take a step back, way back, so to speak, the way back machine kind of way back, because this drive for convenience and efficiency, that always hasn't been the case. Like many other things, retail has evolved over the decades. So take us back a few, as we often say, this podcast isn't a history lesson, but I think in this context, it's very instructive to understand where we were and how we got here. Take us back to the 1975, and let's see where we were and how we got here.
Convenience is one of these words that I think, and there's a danger of getting a little bit too much into semantics here, but convenience has really changed over the past several decades. And sometimes it's funny when I talk to people that are significantly younger than you and I are, and I say, well, department stores and malls used to be very convenient. And they were like, well, what do you mean?
What?
Well, the reason why they were convenient, and not in every aspect, but they were convenient because that was where you could go and see a lot of stuff in one place. So it was worth, when you didn't have, you didn't have the internet at all, but you didn't have the plethora of competitive choices, which we'll talk about a bit more in a second. Yeah. So in an era where, 97, 98% of everything you bought required you to go to a physical location, when it came to shopping for apparel, gifts, a lot of the sort of products that were the dominant tenant mix of a mall, the malls and those department stores that were, the overwhelming majority of their locations were in these regional malls, that was very convenient. When you start to kind of move forward into the 80s, a lot of what you saw was the great expansion of the discount mass merchants. This was the era where Walmart in particular was adding a lot of stores, but also Kmart and Target. And so you started to have these general merchandise locations that became large in number that were not in the mall. And so the spending started to get affected. And, and mom and pop stores were affected by the growth of Walmart and others as well. But again, you still had a case where 97, 98% of all purchases involved you going someplace. It's just now you had other choices for apparel that were from these big retailers. When you get into
those and we should probably speak to those other couple of 3%, the catalog business, right? So the catalog was convenient in one way, but not in the way we think of it today. I mean, it had an assortment. Think of back to the Sears catalog or the big catalogers, but. You remember, I remember a time where, hey, 6 to 8 weeks, it'll be at your door. Isn't that convenient? Like it was a different context.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah. Right. Right. The other percentage was primarily mail order catalog. And, most of the mail order catalogs that were successful outside of Sears and Montgomery Ward had kind of a niche. They were focused on a particular sort of product category. And so maybe you bought from the catalog because you didn't have great selection of stores near you, or you really like that particular product. But yeah, you're right. You oftentimes had to wait for weeks. And when I was first in the catalog business in the 90s, we were pretty happy if we can get something to you in a week, so, and we used to charge.
Handling included by that.
Yeah. Well, and I think you and I talked about this on another episode. We would make money charging for expedited delivery. But then, as you get into the 90s, a couple things start to happen. We're still where, something like 97, 98% of all retail involves people, driving to a store and getting it. But we start to really see the acceleration of the category killers. So, Best Buy, Circuit City, and others in home electronics, Bed Bath & Beyond, Linens and Things, the pet supply guys, Home Depot, Lowe's. I mean, these formats really started to accelerate. And so you had thousands of these stores being built all over the U.S. And that started to definitely affect the mom and pop, Main Street sort of stores. But this was like another big hit to the department stores and the malls because you now had a number of other choices that were in many respects more convenient because they were closer to you. But they were also convenient in that you had a wider assortment. You can go to one of these category killers and have a lot more choice than you could from a standard retailer, whether it was in the mall or not. And of course, then, late 90s, early 2000s in particular, convenience starts to really be redefined by e-commerce. And, as I go to in the book, and I think we talked about on another episode, and we don't, get too much of a history lesson, but I think it's important to think about the rise of e-commerce in a few waves, because the first wave, particularly driven by Amazon, but also driven by some of the major retailers like Sears and others that were first to get into, the .com business pretty early on, or the mail order catalog companies that took their business online. For the most part, that first wave was products that were pretty simple to understand. Like you already knew you wanted the Mr. Coffee Pot, or you knew you wanted that book or CD back when there were CDs from Amazon. And almost all of that was shipped through the mail to your home or office. So pretty simple product, easy to understand products, very focused distribution system. Over time, again, largely driven by Amazon, but also bigger retailers getting more involved in e-commerce. The products you could buy online started to expand. So e-commerce penetration continued to increase. But again, most of these products were shipped to your home or office through the mail. What really started to shift, and this is really only the last 5 years or so, not only are you getting more products, but you start to have products that are local home delivery, particularly groceries, or frozen foods. These are things that you can't ship, or it's prohibitively expensive to ship through FedEx or USPS. And so this whole e-commerce world started to be more complicated, started to add buy online, pick up in store, started to have, delivery, restaurant delivery, and all this kind of stuff. So what we call e-commerce is now much more diverse, not as simplistic as just shipping through home product. But again, this kind of accelerated convenience. A lot more products now could be shipped to your home or office. You didn't have to go get it. And now, instead of going to a store to see this array of products that are on offer, you now have, the so-called endless aisle of the
internet of everything.
Yeah. Right. So convenience redefined both in terms of easy to find stuff, easy to understand the price, easy to get information about what products might fit for you, without having to go to a store, without having to talk to an associate, and also being able to get things delivered. I mean, we've gone from, like you were talking about, a week or two or longer to 2 days, next day, 30 minutes.
The history lesson kind of drives us through to where we are today, but take us to the current events where, you've got to make some choices around who and what you are, but what framework do you put around those choices, and how do you approach it?
Sure. Let me just make one other quick point, though, in the history lesson part of it. The other thing, which I think sometimes gets overlooked, is one of the things that's really happened quite a bit in the last, say, 10 years, because, a lot of times, so much of when we talk about the troubles in department stores or with certain kinds of retailers, it's all about online. But actually, the other thing that happened kind of in the post-category killer world was the opening of a lot of value-oriented retailers. So the explosion in dollar stores, the explosion in off-price retailers like TJ Maxx, even in the grocery business, Aldi, Lidl, Trader Joe's. These are not, in fact, they're lower than average online penetration businesses, but they've opened thousands of stores in people's neighborhoods, basically, or in power centers that are much more accessible, much more convenient than the mall, than the moderate department stores. And even Kohl's growth, even though they're struggling, but, if you go back 15 or 20 years, they were seen as somebody that really affected the predominance of the mall and moderate, traditional moderate department stores. So convenience has also evolved, obviously, by virtue of the internet, but it's also evolved by just a lot more choices, 5 or 10 minutes from where, 90%, 95% of the population lives. So to talk about the implications of this, if you were a retailer that was, historically brick and mortar oriented, with part of your competitive advantage being it was convenient to drive or get on a bus or whatever to go to your store to see all this stuff that wasn't super well differentiated. Well, that competitive advantage has continued to be evaporated, over, really a 20-year period. And, the poster child for this is certainly the mall-based department stores, Macy's, Penny's, Sears, et cetera. But it also explains what's happened with Toys R Us. It also explains the trouble that Bed Bath & Beyond has had, which is really accelerated, which is, perhaps a whole other topic. It explains the trouble that Kohl's, which was, doing so well 15 years ago, and is now, really in a significant amount of trouble, because going to their store to see a wide assortment of largely undifferentiated product, where is the advantage in that? It's not convenient to go someplace to see that stuff anymore. Whereas 15 or 20 years ago was tremendously convenient. So I think this collapse of the middle, this bifurcation, is really saying, well, on the one hand, consumers are, tending to when they're in buying mode, that tends to be about easy access, low prices. It varies obviously depending upon the sort of products you're buying, but that helps explain the tremendous growth in online, because e-commerce is very good at the buying side of the equation. But it also explains why value retailers like the dollar stores, like TJ Maxx, have so outperformed other brick and mortar dominant retailers. And at the other end of the spectrum, luxury generally has tended to do well because those products are largely exclusive. So, and luxury has done well in store and online. Neiman Marcus, my former employer, 40% of their business is online. Nordstrom, something like 40% of their business is online. Yeah. So, but it's the value added of either the differentiated product or the differentiated service or the differentiated in-store experience. But if you're one of these retailers in the middle that, is trying to rely on this incredible assortment in a physical store where, you've got okay prices, but maybe not the best, or you don't have anything particular from a service standpoint.
It's not remarkable. Is there any question for you? Is there any room in your framework? I mean, part of the rise of the dollar store and what you're describing is also reflected of the macro state, and not just in America, but around the world in some ways of the elimination almost of the middle class, right? Because the middle class in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was quite fulsome, and that's what drove that kind of middle, literally. Whereas now we've not only do you have bifurcation of shopping, but you tend to have some fairly severe bifurcation of income, household incomes, right? So is there room for that in helping along these trends?
Well, I make this point in the book that there's really, to your point, there's two parts of the bifurcation. There's sort of the strategic business model bifurcation where the middle has collapsed because of largely the impact of digital disruption. But the middle this collapse of the middle has also been accelerated by macroeconomic factors. So as the rich get richer, their dollars are tending to go to the more shopping side of the equation. They've got the money to spend on experiences. They've got the money to spend on more premium priced products. As the middle class gets hollowed out, for the most part, those folks are needing to trade down because it's, a sheer affordability issue. So, it's a little bit of a chicken or egg thing here. We certainly had value-oriented retailers growing prior to this bifurcation of macroeconomic factors. But as those forces have accelerated over the last, 10 years or so, that tends to support this further widening. Now, this is not to say, because I get this question sometimes, this is not to say from a product assortment standpoint, there are no moderate prices. Like I think the good, better, best, which I'm sure some of our listeners will be familiar with, like there's still relevance to the good, better, best assortment strategy. It's really more of a question from a fundamental value proposition. Are you really leaning into the buying side, or are you leaning into the shopping side fundamentally? The other point I would make is, and this might be a good opportunity to talk about Target and what kind of the way they're thinking about it is, it's not like, I don't want to make this overly black and white. It's not like within a given store, you can't have a mix of buying and shopping. Target apparently is even experimenting with this idea that kind of one side of their store is going to be about ease, so buying, and the other side is going to be about experience. And, if you think about it just from a store layout standpoint, and you've got two doors, there may be some advantage to say, hey, I'm just running into Target to get, whatever, some aspirin, something for my, for dinner tonight or whatever. But I'm going into the other side because, I'm working on a home decorating project or whatever, and I might want to put
or I don't know what I'm looking for, right?
Right. I want to explore a little bit. And so, from a visual, not only from a product assortment, but from a visual merchandising side, it may be more about providing ideas, right? I don't need any ideas when I'm just running in to pick up some bananas and Tylenol, right? I know what I want. So I think, again, it's not that black and white, but I think when it comes to thinking about your overall business model, are you more trying to be, RH, Sephora, Apple, Saks Fifth Avenue, or are you trying to be more, Walmart, Aldi, those sort of very buying dominant, so there's some fundamental choices in terms of your strategy that has implications over the long term in terms of, how big your stores are, where they're located, the specific, role, design, operating model, and you can kind of go from there.
And what happens in them? Last question. I want to bring this home on this. I did this interesting interview with author Sun Yu, and his book is all about friction. And it was an interesting idea, and you and I were talking about it off mic. But I'd hope you to comment to it. His concept or idea is, and you and I would know this, but he really fleshed it out
pretty well is that at some point, at some time, it's not just about convenience, right? It's not about being able to do something super fast. That there's a few speed bumps in the road. You're adding a bit of friction, which actually enhances the customer experience. On one hand, it feels counterintuitive, but comment on that, because I know we talk about it often that, in many cases, in the context of experience, whether it's going up the elevator 8 floors in an RH location or whatever, that there is some, let's call it friction, but really let's call it shopping, right? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it is, what is, when you think about being remarkable, the biggest part, not to go into too much of what the book is about, but the distinction I make in this idea of being remarkable is both that you are, highly distinctive, unique, etc. But it's also, and the real X factor, I think, is the powerful emotional connection that you make with your customer. And such that they will be intensely loyal, but also that they will be literally willing to talk about it, to remark upon it. And so I think, when you think about, does anybody have a powerful emotional connection with Amazon? You may have a lot of frequency bias towards it because it's so efficient and because, it's easy to get your needs met or whatever. But there's not an emotional attachment to Amazon because that brand is an engineering brand. It's a buying brand. It's about efficiency, right? The brands, though, so it's very powerful, but it's powerful because it's so remarkable at the buying side of it. When you think about the most powerful emotional brands, Apple, Tesla, RH, big list of them.
IKEA,
I'm sure that people,
even IKEA,
yeah,
right.
Right.
Certainly look convenient to shop IKEA, right? You got to drive 40 minutes to get there,
but you have an emotional connection, and I think the way to think about it is, it's not about buying a product; it is about buying a story. Like, you are buying into the story of the brand, as our friend Seth likes to say. People like us do things like this. It's about belonging and all these kind of things. And so, if you're not willing to go through a little bit of a hassle in some cases, or you're not willing to feel like, it's worth it for me to invest the time and money to learn about this, or to travel a long way, or to sit online for 4 hours to get that Apple phone or whatever, like that, there's part of that binding you to the brand because you've made the investment. And I think psychologically, which is maybe what he's talking about, there's a little bit of rationalizing, like, I must love this, or otherwise, why would I go through all the effort? Right? So, but I think, again, I don't want to make it overly black and white, but I think if you think about the most powerful brands that have emerged in this, newer era, they are, either pretty strong on the shopping part of it and the involvement and that real kind of heart emotional connection. And then there are those really like smart brands. Like, it's smart to shop at Costco. It's smart to shop at TJ Maxx. It's smart to shop at Amazon, right? But it's not about, I'm having this incredible emotional experience. It's about, I'm a savvy shopper. And those are really different emotional states, but it's death in the middle. That's my main point, is you've got to pick a lane or move pretty strongly in the direction. Because the other side is, if you look at the brands that have gotten into trouble, Sears now for a long time, but JCPenney, Bed Bath & Beyond, Toys R Us, they didn't pick a lane. And I think that's the lesson strategically. There's plenty of other good reasons to get into the details around designing particular customer journeys and how to better target your marketing and context and, all that kind of stuff. It's useful as well. But I think the strategic takeaway is much more, kind of fundamentally, which lane are you picking?
Yeah. Well, it's a great discussion because we're 5 seasons in now, but it really helps to hone in on key points we've been making. We made a lot, and as we covered the book, but these ideas come back, and I think as our theme for this season, buckle up, Buttercup. You better really start thinking about these more deeply, and so I think this has been a really great discussion. So let's leave it there, and we got the rest of the season to continue to flush out this and many other points. But until next time, let's leave it there.